April 22, 1951. 2,200 hours. Kapyong Valley, South Korea. 23-year-old Lieutenant Michael Joseph Levy of the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, stood in a fighting trench on Hill 677, watching the horizon to the north burn orange with artillery fire. The temperature had dropped to 4 degrees Celsius, cold enough that his breath misted in the darkness. Behind him, 700 Canadian and Australian soldiers were preparing defensive positions along a narrow valley that military planners in Tokyo had designated the Kapyong Corridor, a 10-kilometer stretch of terrain that provided the only practical invasion route from the Chinese-occupied mountains to Seoul, 42 kilometers south. Lieutenant Levy had been in Korea for 3 months. He commanded a rifle platoon of 38 soldiers, most of them volunteers from Alberta and British Columbia, who had enlisted after the Korean War began in June 1950. They were equipped with Lee Enfield rifles, Bren light machine guns, and 3-inch mortars, the same weapons the British Army had used during World War II. Their uniforms were Canadian battle dress, olive drab wool, that provided reasonable warmth but poor camouflage against Korean terrain. They had trained for 9 weeks at Fort Lewis, Washington, before deploying to Korea. Most had never experienced combat before arriving in theater. What separated these 700 Commonwealth soldiers from the approximately 60,000 other UN troops deployed in Korea was their immediate tactical situation. They were the last intact offensive position between a collapsing UN front line and the South Korean capital. 20 kilometers north of their position, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army had launched its 5th phase offensive, a massive assault involving 350,000 soldiers attacking across a 200-kilometer front. The offensive had begun at 1800 hours on April 22nd, and within 4 hours it shattered 2 South Korean divisions and penetrated 16 kilometers into UN-held territory. Chinese forces were now advancing south along multiple axes, and military intelligence estimated that at least 5 Chinese divisions, approximately 60,000 soldiers, were moving toward the Kapyong Valley. The 27th British Commonwealth Brigade, to which the Canadian and Australian battalions belonged, had been ordered to establish blocking positions in the Kapyong Valley and delay Chinese forces for as long as tactically feasible. This military euphemism meant that 700 soldiers were expected to slow down an enemy force that outnumbered them by more than 80 to 1, buying time for UN headquarters to establish new defensive lines closer to Seoul. The brigade commander, Brigadier Basil Aubrey-Code, had positioned his forces along the valley in a series of defensive hills. The 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, approximately 500 soldiers, occupied Hill 504 on the western side of the valley. The 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, approximately 700 soldiers, occupied Hill 677 on the eastern side, approximately 3 kilometers northeast of the Australian position. Between these 2 hills ran the Kapyong River, a shallow watercourse that was fordable at multiple locations. North of both hills, the valley opened into mountain terrain that Chinese forces controlled. South of both hills, the valley narrowed into the corridor that led to Seoul. The tactical concept was simple. Australian and Canadian forces would occupy the high ground on either side of the valley, creating a gauntlet through which any Chinese advance would have to pass. Artillery and mortar fire from the hills would destroy Chinese forces moving through the valley floor. If Chinese forces attempted to bypass the valley by moving through the mountains, the rough terrain would slow their advance and reduce their combat effectiveness. This plan assumed that Chinese commanders would follow conventional military doctrine and attempt to push through the valley using their numerical superiority. It did not account for the possibility that Chinese forces would ignore the valley entirely and instead attack the hills directly, accepting catastrophic casualties to eliminate the defensive positions blocking their route to Seoul. Lieutenant Levy had been briefed on the tactical situation at 1900 hours by his company commander, Major John Vernon Mills, a World War II veteran who had fought in Italy and Northwest Europe. Mills had been characteristically direct. "The Chinese are coming. We don't know how many, but intelligence estimates at least 20,000 in our sector. Our job is to hold these hills until ordered to withdraw. If we lose these positions, the Chinese have a clear road to Seoul." Questions? There had been no questions. The Canadian soldiers understood the mathematics. They were outnumbered approximately 30 to 1. They were occupying defensive positions that had been prepared in less than 6 hours, consisting of shallow trenches and hasty fighting positions. They had limited ammunition. Each rifleman carried 50 rounds. Each Bren gun crew had 800 rounds, and the battalion's 3-inch mortars had approximately 200 rounds per tube. Artillery support was available from the 2nd Regiment, Royal Canadian Horse Artillery, positioned 7 kilometers south. But artillery ammunition was also limited after weeks of continuous defensive operations. At 2,230 hours on April 22nd, Lieutenant Levy watched as South Korean soldiers began streaming past his position, moving south in disorganized groups. Some were wounded. Many had abandoned their weapons. Officers were attempting to maintain unit cohesion, but most South Korean units had disintegrated after the initial Chinese assault. Levy counted approximately 3,000 South Korean soldiers passing through his sector between 22:30 and midnight. None of them stopped to reinforce the Canadian positions. They were retreating as fast as exhaustion and darkness allowed. At 0030 hours on April 23rd, the first Chinese soldiers appeared at the northern edge of the Kapyong Valley. Lieutenant Levy saw them through binoculars, small groups of infantry moving south along the valley floor, following the retreating South Korean forces. They were not advancing in formation. They were pursuing, moving quickly, attempting to maintain contact with the fleeing enemy. Levy estimated he was observing elements of at least 2 Chinese regiments, approximately 4,000 soldiers, moving through terrain that was covered by his battalion's defensive fires. Major Mills gave the order at 0045 hours. All units, fire mission. Target: enemy infantry in valley. Grid reference 347892. Commence firing on my command. The Canadian mortars fired first, 60 high-explosive rounds in rapid succession, impacting in a pattern across the valley floor approximately 800 meters north of the Canadian positions. The explosions illuminated Chinese soldiers who had been invisible in the darkness. They scattered, taking cover, returning fire with small arms. Then the artillery joined, 18 25-pounder guns from the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery, firing at maximum rate, putting 108 rounds into valley in less than 3 minutes. The result was devastating. Chinese infantry caught in the open suffered catastrophic casualties. Bodies lay scattered across the valley floor. Survivors took cover in drainage ditches, behind rocks, in any terrain feature that provided protection from the continuing artillery fire. The Chinese advance through the valley stopped completely. For approximately 30 minutes, there was no movement. Chinese forces had learned that advancing through the valley meant death. At 0130 hours, Chinese commanders made a decision that would define the Battle of Kapyong. If they could not advance through the valley, they would eliminate the defensive positions on the hills. Chinese forces began moving toward the Australian position on Hill 504, not in small groups but in battalion strength, approximately 1,200 soldiers advancing in extended formations, using darkness and terrain to close the Australian defenses. The 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Edgar Ferguson, detected the Chinese advance at 0145 hours when an Australian listening post reported movement to the north. Ferguson immediately ordered his forward companies to stand to, every soldier in fighting positions, weapons loaded, ready for immediate action. At 0158 hours, the Chinese attacked. The assault began with a barrage of mortar fire, approximately 200 rounds impacting on Hill 504 in less than 5 minutes. The Australian positions were well prepared, with overhead cover and deep trenches, but the volume of fire was intense enough that several fighting positions suffered direct hits. 3 Australian soldiers were killed in the initial barrage, 7 more wounded. Before the wounded could be evacuated, Chinese infantry was already closing on the Australian perimeter. What happened next was unlike any combat that Australian soldiers had experienced in World War II or in previous Korean War engagements. The Chinese assault was not a coordinated attack with fire and maneuver. It was a human wave, hundreds of soldiers moving forward simultaneously, accepting casualties, relying on mass and momentum to overwhelm defensive positions. The attackers carried a mixture of weapons. Some had Soviet PPSH submachine guns. Some had rifles. Many carried only grenades or satchel charges. They advanced blowing bugles and whistles, creating noise and confusion, making it difficult for defenders to coordinate fire. Australian soldiers opened fire at ranges under 100 meters. Bren guns, positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, cut down the first wave of attackers. Riflemen fired as rapidly as they could reload. Mortar crews dropped illumination rounds to light the battlefield, then switched to high-explosive rounds aimed at Chinese assembly areas. The volume of fire was so intense that rifle barrels became too hot to touch. Empty brass casings piled up in fighting positions. But the Chinese kept coming. When the first wave was destroyed, a second wave advanced over the bodies. When the second wave was stopped, a third wave attacked from a different direction. Chinese commanders were implementing a doctrine that had been developed during the Chinese Civil War. accept catastrophic casualties in the initial assault to identify defensive strong points, then concentrate follow-on forces against identified weak points. The tactic was brutally effective. By 0245 hours, Chinese forces had penetrated the Australian perimeter in 2 locations. Lieutenant Colonel Ferguson made a critical decision. Rather than attempt to seal the penetrations with local counterattacks, which would weaken his defensive line, he ordered his forward companies to withdraw to secondary positions approximately 200 meters south. This withdrawal was not a retreat. It was a planned disengagement, executed under fire, designed to create distance between Australian and Chinese forces, so that artillery could be employed without endangering friendly troops. The withdrawal began at 0255 hours. Australian soldiers moved in small groups, covering each other, maintaining fire discipline. Chinese forces attempted to pursue, but were immediately hit by coordinated artillery fire from New Zealand artillery batteries, supporting the brigade. The artillery fire was directed by Australian forward observers who remained in advanced positions specifically to control fires during the withdrawal. Over the next 20 minutes, New Zealand guns fired 325 rounds into northern slopes of Hill 504, destroying Chinese forces attempting to pursue the withdrawing Australians. By 0330 hours, the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, had established new defensive positions on the southern portion of Hill 504. They had lost 11 soldiers killed and 23 wounded in the initial Chinese assault. They had expended approximately 40% of their rifle ammunition and 60% of their Bren gun ammunition, but they had stopped the Chinese advance. More than 300 Chinese soldiers laid dead on the northern slopes of Hill 504, and Chinese commanders had concluded that continuing the assault would result in complete destruction of the attacking units. At 0345 hours, Chinese forces shifted their attention to Canadian position on Hill 677. Lieutenant Michael Levy watched through his binoculars as Chinese soldiers began moving toward his battalion's positions. He counted at least 6 separate columns, each approximately 200 soldiers, advancing through broken terrain north and east of Hill 677. They were not attempting to advance through the valley floor, where Canadian mortars and artillery could destroy them. Instead, they were moving through mountain approaches, using draws and ridgelines to mask their movement, closing on the Canadian position from multiple directions simultaneously. Major Mills recognized the Chinese tactic immediately. This was not a frontal assault. It was an encirclement. Chinese forces were attempting to surround Hill 677, cut off withdrawal routes, and then destroy the Canadian battalion through coordinated attacks from multiple directions. Mills radioed brigade headquarters at 0350 hours with situation report. Chinese forces approximately 1,200 strong moving to encircle our position. Request immediate artillery support on targets north and east of Hill 677. Battalion preparing for defense in place. Brigadier Code's response was immediate. Artillery support approved. Hold your position as long as possible. If situation becomes untenable, withdraw to Rally Point Charlie. Rally Point Charlie was a location 8 kilometers south. Effectively, Code was authorizing Mills to abandon Hill 677 if the position became indefensible. But Mills had no intention of withdrawing. His battalion was the last defensive position between Chinese forces and the Kapyong corridor. If Hill 677 fell, Chinese forces would have an unobstructed route to Seoul. At 0415 hours, Chinese forces began their assault on the Canadian positions. The attack followed the same pattern as the earlier assault on the Australian position. Mortar barrage followed by infantry assault in waves. But the Chinese had learned from their experience at Hill 504. Instead of attacking the strongest Canadian positions directly, they focused their assault on battalion's northeast flank, D Company, commanded by Captain John Gordon Fothergill Mills, no relation to Major Mills, occupying positions on a ridgeline that extended from Hill 677 toward the mountains. D Company consisted of 123 soldiers organized into 3 rifle platoons and a company headquarters. They occupied approximately 600 meters of defensive line, with fighting positions spaced 15 to 20 meters apart. It was a thin line, vulnerable to penetration if Chinese forces could concentrate overwhelming force at any single point. Captain Mills had prepared for this possibility by positioning his reserve platoon, 38 soldiers under Lieutenant Levy, in a central location from which they could counterattack any Chinese penetration. The Chinese assault hit D Company at 0420 hours. Approximately 400 Chinese soldiers attacked simultaneously along a 300-meter front, advancing in waves, blowing bugles, throwing grenades. The volume of fire was overwhelming. Canadian soldiers fired until their rifles jammed from overheating, cleared the jams, and fired again. Bren gun crews fired continuous bursts until their barrels glowed red, but the Chinese kept coming. At 0433 hours, Chinese forces penetrated the Canadian line between 10 platoon and 11 platoon, a gap of approximately 30 meters where the terrain made it impossible to maintain visual contact between positions. Approximately 60 Chinese soldiers poured through the gap, moving into the Canadian rear area, threatening to split the company in half. Lieutenant Levy received the order at 0434 hours. 10 platoon penetrated. Chinese in company rear. Counterattack immediately. Drive them back through the gap. Levy's platoon launched their counterattack at 0435 hours. 38 soldiers moving through darkness toward an enemy force of unknown size. They advanced an extended line, firing rifles and throwing grenades, creating maximum noise and confusion. The Chinese soldiers who had penetrated the line were disorganized, unsure of their location, focused on moving forward rather than defending against counterattack. Levy's platoon hit them from an unexpected direction and drove them back through the gap in 12 minutes of close-quarters combat. By 0450 hours, the Canadian line was restored, but D Company had paid a heavy price. 17 soldiers killed, 29 wounded. More than one-third of the company's strength was gone. Ammunition was critically low. Some soldiers were down to their last magazine. Medical supplies were exhausted. The company aid post was overwhelmed with wounded who could not be evacuated because Chinese forces surrounded the position. Captain Mills radioed battalion headquarters at 0455 hours. D Company situation critical. 1/3 casualties. Ammunition nearly exhausted. Chinese forces massing for another assault. Request immediate resupply and reinforcement. Major Mills' response would define the next 72 hours of the Battle of Kapyong. No reinforcement available. All companies engaged. Ammunition resupply impossible while Chinese control approaches. Hold your position. Artillery support inbound. What followed was one of the most controversial and desperate tactical decisions in Canadian military history. At 0458 hours, Captain Mills made a radio call to the artillery. Fire mission. All available guns. Target. My position. Danger close. Repeat. Danger close on my position. Danger close was artillery terminology indicating that friendly forces were within 600 meters of the target. Close enough that friendly casualties from artillery fire were probable. Captain Mills was not requesting danger close fire. He was requesting fire directly on his own position. He was asking artillery to shell Hill 677 while Canadian soldiers were still in their fighting positions, gambling that the overhead cover and trenches would protect his soldiers while the artillery destroyed Chinese forces massing for another assault. The artillery officer receiving the request, Captain James Ross McLean of the 2nd Regiment, Royal Canadian Horse Artillery, recognized what Mills was asking. He also understood that refusing the request meant D Company would be overrun. At 0502 hours, McLean gave the order, all guns, fire mission. Target, Hill 677, grid reference 349895. Danger close. Commence firing. 18 25-pounder guns opened fire simultaneously, putting 108 rounds onto Hill 677 in less than 90 seconds. The explosions walked across the Canadian position in a pattern designed to destroy everything in the target area. Chinese soldiers caught in the open were shredded by shrapnel. Survivors fled down the hill, abandoning the assault. The artillery fire continued for 8 minutes. Total of 432 rounds impacting on and around D Company's positions. When the firing stopped, D Company conducted a casualty assessment. Miraculously, only 2 Canadian soldiers had been wounded by friendly artillery fire, both minor shrapnel injuries. The overhead cover in trenches had protected the Canadians while the artillery destroyed Chinese forces that had been massing for another assault. Captain Mills counted 73 Chinese bodies within 50 meters of his position. The assault had been stopped, but the cost was staggering. D Company had 56 soldiers remaining combat effective out of an original strength of 123. At 0530 hours, as dawn broke over the Kapyong Valley, both Canadian and Australian battalions remained in their positions. They had survived the initial Chinese assault, but Chinese commanders were not withdrawing. They were preparing for a second night of attacks. And the Commonwealth soldiers knew that they could not survive another night like the one they had just experienced. The mathematics of attrition were clear. If the Chinese attacked again with the same intensity, the defensive positions would fall. The only question was whether Commonwealth forces could hold long enough for UN headquarters to establish new defensive lines to the south. April 23, 1951. 1,400 hours. Hill 677, Kapyong Valley. Major John Vernon Mills stood in what remained of D Company's defensive positions, surveying the battlefield through binoculars. The morning sun illuminated a scene of devastation that he would remember for the rest of his life. The northern slopes of Hill 677 were littered with bodies. Chinese soldiers killed during the night assault lie in positions where artillery and small arms fire had caught them. Mills counted 117 visible bodies, knowing there were likely more in dead ground and draws. The smell of death was already noticeable in the warming air. His battalion had survived the first night, but barely. Total casualties: 32 killed, 61 wounded, 3 missing. That represented 13% of his combat strength gone in one night. Ammunition expenditure had been catastrophic. The battalion had fired approximately 70,000 rounds of small arms ammunition, 1,800 mortar rounds, and had consumed indirect fire support equivalent to 432 artillery rounds on D Company's position alone. Resupply was becoming critical. At 1,430 hours, Mills assembled his company commanders for a situation briefing. The 4 captains, representing A, B, C, and D companies, were exhausted, begrimed with powder smoke and dirt, but focused. Mills was direct. Intelligence estimates Chinese have committed elements of 3 divisions to the Kapyong sector. That's approximately 30,000 soldiers. Last night they hit us with approximately 2,000. They tested our defenses and learned our strong points. Tonight they'll come back with more forces and better tactics. We need to assume they'll attack in greater strength, and we need to prepare accordingly. Captain Mills of D Company asked the critical question: do we have resupply coming? Ammunition situation is critical. If they hit us like last night, we'll run dry within 2 hours. Major Mills shook his head. Resupply by vehicle is impossible. Chinese control all ground approaches. Brigade is attempting to organize helicopter resupply, but there are only 2 available helicopters in theater, and they're already committed to medical evacuation. We may get an airdrop, but that's dependent on weather and aircraft availability. Assume no resupply. Fight with what we have. The implications were clear. If Chinese forces attacked again that night, the Canadian battalion would have to defend with reduced ammunition stocks, reduced manpower, and no possibility of reinforcement. The defensive concept would have to change from static defense to something more flexible, using terrain, maneuver, and artillery to multiply combat power. Mills outlined his plan. We're going to implement a defense in depth. Forward positions will be lightly manned, observation posts only, with orders to fall back to main defensive positions when Chinese assault begins. Main defensive line will be on the military crest of the hill, positioned to maximize artillery support. Reserve company will be positioned for counterattack against any penetration. The goal is to draw Chinese forces into killing zones where we can destroy them with artillery rather than small arms. Conserve ammunition. Let the artillery do the heavy lifting. It was sound tactical doctrine, but it required something that was psychologically difficult for soldiers to accept: surrendering ground voluntarily. The forward positions that Canadian soldiers had fought to hold during the night would be abandoned, allowing Chinese forces to occupy them without resistance. Mills knew his soldiers would hate this. Soldiers instinctively want to hold every inch of ground they paid for in blood. But conservation of combat power required accepting that some ground wasn't worth defending. At 1,600 hours, the Canadian battalion began implementing the new defensive plan. Forward positions were thinned to skeleton crews, 2 or 3 soldiers per position, equipped with radios, with orders to observe Chinese movement and fall back when attacked. The main defensive line was reinforced and improved. Deeper trenches, better overhead cover, fighting positions oriented to create interlocking fields of fire. Artillery forward observers positioned themselves in locations with clear observation of the northern approaches, ready to call immediate fire missions. Simultaneously, 3 kilometers to the west, the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, was conducting its own defensive preparations. Lieutenant Colonel Ferguson had reached the same tactical conclusions as Major Mills. Another night of static defense would result in his battalion being overrun. The Australian solution was different, but complementary to the Canadian approach. Ferguson ordered his forward companies to prepare ambush positions on the approaches to Hill 504. Small teams of Australian soldiers, typically 8 to 10 men, would position themselves along likely Chinese avenues of approach, engage Chinese forces at close range, inflict casualties, and then withdraw before Chinese forces could respond effectively. The goal was to disrupt Chinese assault preparations, create confusion, and force Chinese commanders to commit forces prematurely. At 1,730 hours, Australian ambush teams moved into position. They carried only light weapons, rifles, submachine guns, grenades, and minimal ammunition. Their orders were explicit. Engage Chinese forces for no more than 3 minutes, then withdraw immediately to pre-planned rally points. The ambush teams were expendable in the sense that they might not survive if Chinese forces reacted quickly, but their sacrifice would buy time for the main defensive positions. At 1845 hours, as darkness fell across the Kapyong Valley, Chinese forces began their preparations for the second night's assault. Intelligence estimates indicated that Chinese commanders had reinforced their forces in the Kapyong sector, bringing total strength to approximately 5,000 soldiers facing the Canadian position and another 4,000 facing the Australian position. The Chinese had also learned from the previous night's combat. Instead of massing forces in obvious assembly areas where artillery could destroy them, Chinese units dispersed into small groups, moved through cover terrain, and maintained radio silence to avoid detection. The first indication that Chinese forces were moving came at 1920 hours, when an Australian ambush team made contact with a Chinese patrol approximately 800 meters north of Hill 504. The ambush was textbook perfect. The Australian team allowed the Chinese patrol to enter the kill zone, opened fire at 15 meters range, killed 11 Chinese soldiers in approximately 40 seconds, and withdrew before Chinese reinforcements could arrive. The ambush achieved its objective. It forced Chinese commanders to assume that the northern approaches to Hill 504 were heavily defended, causing them to shift their assault route to more difficult terrain. The first indication that Chinese forces were moving came at 1920 hours, when an Australian ambush team made contact with Chinese patrol approximately 800 meters north of Hill 504. The ambush was textbook perfect. The Australian team allowed the Chinese patrol to enter the kill zone, opened fire at 15 meters range, killed 11 Chinese soldiers in approximately 40 seconds, and withdrew before Chinese reinforcements could arrive. The ambush achieved its objective. It forced Chinese commanders to assume that the northern approaches to Hill 504 were heavily defended, causing them to shift their assault route to more difficult terrain. At 2015 hours, the first Chinese assault began against the Canadian position. Approximately 600 Chinese soldiers attacked D Company's forward positions, the same sector that had been penetrated the previous night. But this time, the positions were lightly manned with only observation posts. The Canadian observers called artillery fire on the approaching Chinese forces, then withdrew to the main defensive line as planned. Chinese forces occupied the forward positions without resistance, believing they had achieved a significant tactical victory. What the Chinese commanders did not realize was that they had moved their assault forces into a pre-planned killing zone. At 2023 hours, Captain McLean of the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery opened fire on the forward positions that Chinese forces now occupied. 18 guns firing at maximum rate put 540 rounds into a 600-meter square area in less than 5 minutes. The artillery fire was devastating. Chinese forces suffered catastrophic casualties, more than 200 killed or wounded in the initial barrage. Survivors retreated down the northern slopes of Hill 677, abandoning the assault. The tactical concept worked exactly as Major Mills had planned. By surrendering the forward positions voluntarily, Canadian forces had drawn Chinese assault forces into terrain where artillery could destroy them without endangering friendly troops. The cost of Canadian battalion: 0 casualties, minimal ammunition expenditure. The cost of Chinese forces: approximately 250 soldiers killed or wounded. But Chinese commanders adapted quickly. At 2,145 hours, a second Chinese assault began, this time targeting the Canadian positions from the east, a different axis of attack that avoided the killing zone where the first assault had been destroyed. Approximately 800 Chinese soldiers moved through mountain terrain, approaching Hill 677 from a direction where the Canadian defensive positions had limited field of fire and where artillery support was less effective due to the steep terrain. The assault hit B Company at 2,203 hours, 137 Canadian soldiers, defending approximately 700 meters of defensive line along the eastern ridge of Hill 677. The Chinese attack was better coordinated than the previous night's assaults. Instead of human wave attacks, Chinese forces moved in small groups, using cover, concentrating fire on specific Canadian positions to suppress them, then maneuvering to close range before throwing grenades. Corporal Smiley McDonald, a 21-year-old soldier from Vancouver, British Columbia, was manning a Bren gun position when the Chinese assault began. His position overlooked a narrow draw that provided covered approach to the Canadian defensive line. McDonald watched through the darkness as Chinese soldiers moved up the draw in groups of 10 to 15, staying low, using terrain effectively. He held his fire, waiting for the Chinese to close to effective range. At approximately 50 meters, McDonald opened fire. The Bren gun fired at a cyclic rate of 500 rounds per minute, approximately 8 rounds per second. McDonald fired in short bursts, 3 to 5 rounds per burst, traversing the gun across a draw. The first burst caught a group of Chinese soldiers in the open, killing 3 and wounding 2 others. The second burst engaged the second group, attempting to take cover behind rocks. The third burst suppressed a Chinese machine gun crew that was attempting to return fire. Within 30 seconds, McDonald had fired approximately 40 rounds and had effectively sealed the draw against Chinese advance. But McDonald's success made his position a priority target for Chinese forces. At 2,207 hours, Chinese mortar fire began impacting around the position. Small 60mm rounds, not powerful enough to destroy the position, but accurate enough to be dangerous. McDonald and his loader, Private Kenneth Robert Barwise from Edmonton, Alberta, remained in position, continuing to fire. At 2,209 hours, a Chinese mortar round landed directly in front of McDonald's position, showering both soldiers with dirt and shrapnel. Barwise was hit in the left arm and shoulder, wounds serious enough to require immediate medical attention. McDonald was untouched. He continued firing. Over the next 23 minutes, Corporal McDonald fired approximately 800 rounds, nearly exhausting his entire basic load of Bren gun ammunition. He stopped 3 separate Chinese attempts to advance up the draw. He killed an estimated 27 Chinese soldiers, wounded at least 15 more, and forced Chinese commanders to abandon that axis of attack entirely. When his ammunition was finally exhausted at 2,232 hours, McDonald picked up a Lee-Enfield rifle from a wounded soldier and continued to defend his position with aimed rifle fire. McDonald's action was typical of the Canadian defense that second night. Individual soldiers, often isolated and under heavy fire, held critical positions through skill, determination, and aggressive use of available firepower. But individual heroism could not overcome the fundamental problem of attrition. By 2,300 hours, B Company had suffered 28 casualties, 20% of its strength. Ammunition was critically low across the entire battalion, and Chinese forces were preparing for another assault. At 2,315 hours, Major Mills made a decision that would save his battalion, but would also generate controversy for decades afterward. He radioed brigade headquarters with a request. Ammunition situation critical. Chinese preparing another assault. Request permission to withdraw to Rally Point Charlie. Brigadier Code's response was immediate and unambiguous. Permission denied. Hold your position. Ammunition resupply inbound via airdrop. Estimated time of arrival 30 minutes. Mills understood what Code was telling him. Retreat was not an option. The 27th Brigade's mission was to delay Chinese forces, and abandoning Hill 677 would eliminate the only defensive position blocking Chinese advance through the Kapyong corridor. The brigade would hold regardless of casualties. The ammunition resupply would arrive, or the battalion would be overrun. At 2,337 hours, Canadian soldiers on Hill 677 heard aircraft engines. A single C-119 flying boxcar transport aircraft appeared overhead, flying at approximately 250 meters altitude, dangerously low, while within range of Chinese small arms fire. The aircraft made a single pass over Hill 677, dropping supply bundles attached to parachutes. 8 bundles hit the Canadian positions. 2 more landed in Chinese-controlled terrain, and 3 bundles failed to deploy their parachutes and were destroyed on impact. The 8 bundles that landed successfully contained approximately 16,000 rounds of rifle ammunition, 3,200 rounds of Bren gun ammunition, 200 mortar rounds, and medical supplies, including plasma, morphine, and bandages. It was not enough to fully resupply the battalion, but it was enough to continue the fight. Canadian soldiers broke open the bundles under fire, distributed ammunition, and returned to their fighting positions within 15 minutes. At 2,355 hours, Chinese forces launched their third and largest assault the night. Approximately 1,200 soldiers attacked simultaneously from 3 directions, north, east, and northeast, attempting to overwhelm Canadian defenses through sheer mass. The assault was coordinated with heavy mortar fire, more than 300 rounds impacting on Canadian positions in the first 5 minutes of the attack. 2 Canadian positions suffered direct hits, killing 7 soldiers instantly and wounding 12 more. Chinese infantry closed within 30 meters of the Canadian defensive line before concentrated fire stopped them. Canadian soldiers fired at point-blank range, rifles, machine guns, grenades, even pistols when soldiers ran out of rifle ammunition. The fighting was savage and personal. Chinese soldiers who penetrated the defensive line were killed in hand-to-hand combat. Canadian soldiers who were wounded continued fighting until they physically could not hold weapons. Lieutenant Levy, commanding what remained of his reserve platoon, now reduced to 23 soldiers from an original 38, received orders at 0012 hours on April 24th to counterattack a Chinese penetration in C Company's sector. His platoon advanced in darkness through terrain they barely knew, following compass bearings, searching for an enemy force of unknown size. At 0017 hours, they made contact. Approximately 40 Chinese soldiers who had penetrated the Canadian line and were attempting to set up a machine gun position in the Canadian rear area. Levy's platoon attacked immediately. There was no time for reconnaissance, no opportunity for careful planning. 23 Canadian soldiers charged 40 Chinese soldiers at ranges under 20 meters, firing rifles and throwing grenades, relying on surprise and aggression to overcome numerical disadvantage. The fight lasted 4 minutes. When it was over, 17 Chinese soldiers were dead, the rest had fled, and Levy's platoon had suffered 6 casualties, 2 killed for wounded. By 0045 hours on April 24th, the Chinese assault had been stopped, but the cost had been devastating. The 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, had suffered 83 additional casualties during the second night, bringing total casualties to 115 killed, or wounded out an original strength of approximately 700. That represented 16% losses in 2 nights. At that rate of attrition, the battalion would cease to exist as a combat effective force within 3 more days. 3 kilometers to the west, the Australian battalion was experiencing similar circumstances. Chinese forces had launched 4 separate assaults against Hill 504 during the second night, each assault larger and better coordinated than the previous. Australian casualties had reached 79 killed or wounded. Ammunition was critically low despite an airdrop similar to the Canadian resupply. And intelligence reports indicated that Chinese forces were preparing for even larger assaults on the third night. At 0130 hours on April 24th, Brigadier Code convened a radio conference with his battalion commanders. The question was simple. Could Commonwealth forces hold for another night? Major Mills and Lieutenant Colonel Ferguson both gave the same assessment. Their battalions could hold for 1 more night, possibly 2, but not indefinitely. Eventually, attrition would reduce combat effectiveness below the minimum necessary to defend the positions. Code made his decision. The 27th Brigade would hold Kapyong for 1 more night, the night of April 24th to 25th. That would give UN headquarters 72 hours total to establish new defensive lines. After that, Commonwealth forces would withdraw to positions closer to Seoul. It was a calculated risk based on mathematical reality. Better to withdraw intact forces that could continue fighting than to hold positions until they were overrun and destroyed. But before they could withdraw, they had to survive 1 more night. And Chinese commanders, recognizing that their window of opportunity was closing, were preparing to commit their remaining reserves for a final overwhelming assault. April 24th, 1951, 1800 hours. Hill 677, Kapyong Valley. Captain John Gordon Fothergill Mills sat in a fighting position that was no longer recognizable as a carefully prepared defensive position it had been 72 hours earlier. Artillery fire and mortar fire had collapsed portions of the trench. Bodies of Chinese soldiers killed during previous assaults lay within meters of the position, too close to the defensive line to retrieve, slowly decomposing in the spring warmth. The position smelled of death cordite and unwashed soldiers who had not left their fighting positions in 3 days. D Company had been reduced to 41 combat effective soldiers from an original strength of 123. Every soldier was wounded to some degree, shrapnel cuts, bruises from explosions, hearing damage from artillery fire. 3 soldiers had severe enough injuries that they should have been evacuated, but remained in their positions because evacuation was impossible while Chinese forces controlled the approaches to Hill 677. Medical supplies were exhausted. The company aid post had run out of morphine 12 hours earlier. Soldiers with serious wounds were making do with field dressings and willpower. At 1830 hours, Captain Mills received the operations order for the night's defense. Major Mills, his battalion commander, had decided on a radical change in defensive tactics for the third night. Instead of attempting to hold the entire defensive perimeter with reduced forces, the battalion would consolidate into a tight defensive box on the highest ground of Hill 677. All companies would withdraw to positions within 300 meters of the battalion command post. The defensive perimeter would be small enough that every position could support adjacent positions with direct fire. Artillery would be pre-planned on all approaches, ready to fire on immediate call. The tactical concept was brutal in its simplicity. Create a fortress position that Chinese forces could not penetrate without suffering catastrophic casualties, then hold that position regardless of cost. There would be no maneuver, no counterattacks, no tactical flexibility, just static defense with maximum application of firepower. It was a last resort of force that had been worn down to the point where sophisticated tactics were no longer possible. Captain Mills briefed the soldiers at 1900 hours. We're pulling back to tighter positions. This is not a retreat. This is consolidation to maximize our defensive capability. Chinese are going to hit us hard tonight. Intelligence estimates they're committing everything they have left. Our job is to hold until 0600 hours. After that, we would draw to new positions 8 kilometers south. That means we need to survive one more night. Just one more night. The withdrawal to consolidated defensive box began at 1930 hours. D Company moved last, covering the withdrawal of other companies, then falling back themselves to positions on the eastern face of the defensive perimeter. The movement was conducted in darkness, under sporadic Chinese mortar fire, with soldiers carrying wounded comrades and as much ammunition as could be physically transported. By 2015 hours, the entire battalion was in the new defensive positions. The defensive box measured approximately 400 meters by 300 meters, roughly the size of 6 football fields. 700 soldiers, now reduced to 585 combat-effective troops, occupied fighting positions along the perimeter. The battalion command post was in the center. Artillery forward observers were positioned on the highest ground with clear observation in all directions. Every soldier knew the plan. When Chinese forces attacked, artillery would destroy them before they could close to grenade range. If Chinese forces penetrated the perimeter, reserve platoons would counterattack immediately to seal the breach. At 2100 hours, Chinese artillery began preparatory fires. This was different from previous nights. The volume of fire was at least double what Commonwealth forces had experienced before, estimated at more than 800 rounds impacting on and around Hill 677 over 30 minutes. The Chinese had brought forward additional artillery, or they had been conserving ammunition for this final assault. Either way, the message was clear. Chinese commanders were committing maximum resources to destroying the Canadian position. Private Albert Edward Moore, a 19-year-old rifleman from Winnipeg, Manitoba, was in a fighting position on the eastern edge of the defensive box when the artillery barrage began. The first round landed 15 meters from his position, showering him and his section with dirt and shrapnel. The second round landed closer, 8 meters. The third round hit directly behind his position, collapsing part of the trench and burying 2 soldiers who had to be frantically dug out by their comrades. Moore counted 23 separate explosions within 50 meters of his position during the 30-minute barrage. When the artillery fire stopped at 2130 hours, there was a brief period of silence, approximately 90 seconds, during which Canadian soldiers prepared for the assault they knew was coming. Some checked weapons. Some prayed. Some simply stared into the darkness, waiting. At 2131 hours and 47 seconds, Chinese forces attacked. The assault came from all directions simultaneously. Intelligence estimates later indicated that Chinese commanders had committed approximately 1,500 soldiers to this final attack, 3 times the force they had used in previous assaults. The attackers advanced in waves, blowing bugles and whistles, throwing grenades, firing small arms. The noise was overwhelming. A continuous roar of gunfire, explosions, shouting, screaming. Canadian soldiers opened fire at ranges under 75 meters. Bren guns fired until their barrels glowed. Riflemen fired until they ran out of ammunition, then picked up weapons from wounded soldiers and fired those. Artillery forward observers called fire mission after fire mission, bringing artillery fire as close as 100 meters from friendly positions. Danger close by any standard, but necessary to stop the mass Chinese assault. Corporal McDonald, still manning his Bren gun position despite wounds suffered the previous night, engaged Chinese forces advancing up the draw that had defended for 2 nights. He fired in short, precise bursts, conserving ammunition, making every round count. His loader, Private Barwise, had been evacuated during the day due to his wounds. So McDonald was loading his own gun, a slower process that reduced his rate of fire, but still effective. Over 23 minutes, McDonald fired 412 rounds, stopped 2 separate Chinese attempts to advance up the draw, and killed an estimated 19 Chinese soldiers before his gun finally jammed due to a broken firing pin. Unable to repair the Bren gun, McDonald picked up a rifle and continued fighting. At 2,204 hours, Chinese forces reached this position. A Chinese soldier threw a grenade that landed in McDonald's fighting position. McDonald picked up a grenade and threw it back, where it exploded among a group of Chinese soldiers, killing 2 and wounding 3 others. A second grenade landed in his position. McDonald threw it back. A third grenade landed behind him, exploding before he could react, wounding him in the back and legs with shrapnel. McDonald remained in his position, firing his rifle at Chinese soldiers who were now within 10 meters, until Lieutenant Levy personally ordered him to withdraw to the aid post for treatment. At 2,215 hours, Chinese forces achieved their first penetration of Canadian defensive box. Approximately 40 Chinese soldiers broke through the defensive line on the northern perimeter, moving into the interior of the Canadian position. They advanced toward the battalion command post, firing submachine guns, throwing grenades, attempting to kill or capture the battalion commander and his staff. Major Mills watched from his command post as Chinese soldiers advanced toward his position. He drew his service pistol, a Browning high-power 9mm, and prepared to defend the command post. Before he could fire, the reserve platoon arrived, 26 soldiers under the command of Lieutenant Wayne Dwight Mitchell from Regina, Saskatchewan. Mitchell's platoon had been positioned specifically to counterattack any penetration, and they executed their mission with textbook precision. The counterattack was violent and decisive. 26 Canadian soldiers charged 40 Chinese soldiers at ranges under 15 meters. The fight was hand-to-hand in some cases, rifle butts, bayonets, even entrenching tools used as weapons. The combat lasted 6 minutes. When it was over, 32 Chinese soldiers were dead. The rest had fled back to the perimeter, and Mitchell's platoon had suffered 9 casualties, 3 killed, 6 wounded. By 22:45 hours, the Chinese assault had been stopped, but the cost had been catastrophic. The Canadian battalion had suffered 47 additional casualties during the 2-hour battle. Total casualties over 3 nights now stood at 162 killed or wounded, 23% of original strength. Ammunition was virtually exhausted. Some positions were down to less than 10 rounds per rifleman. Medical supplies were completely gone. The battalion could not survive another assault. At 2,300 hours, Brigadier Code made the decision that would end the Battle of Kapyong. He ordered both Canadian and Australian battalions to withdraw to rally points 8 kilometers south. The withdrawal will begin at 0200 hours on April 25th and will be covered by artillery fire from all available guns. Chinese forces would not be allowed to pursue. Any Chinese attempt to follow the withdrawing Commonwealth forces would be destroyed by artillery. The withdrawal order was both relief and disappointment for the Commonwealth soldiers. Relief because they had survived 3 nights of hell and would now leave the killing ground of Kapyong Valley. Disappointment because soldiers who had paid for Hill 677 in blood did not want to surrender it voluntarily. Major Mills addressed the battalion at 0130 hours on April 25th. We've been ordered to withdraw. This is not defeat. This is mission accomplishment. Our job was to delay Chinese forces for 72 hours. We've held for 74 hours. We've cost the Chinese approximately 2,000 casualties. We've bought time for new defensive lines to be established. We've done our job. Now we withdraw intact, regroup, and prepare for the next fight. The withdrawal began at 0200 hours. Canadian soldiers moved in organized groups, carrying their wounded, taking their weapons and as much equipment as could be transported. Chinese forces attempted to harass the withdrawal, but were immediately hit by mass artillery fire that destroyed any Chinese forces that emerged from cover. By 0445 hours, the entire Canadian battalion had reached the rally point 8 kilometers south. They had successfully disengaged from an enemy force that still outnumbered them more than 3-1. The Australian withdrawal followed the same pattern. By 0530 hours on April 25th, both Commonwealth battalions were clear of the Kapyong Valley. Chinese forces occupied Hill 677 and Hill 504 without further resistance. But the Chinese advance towards Seoul had been stopped. The 74 hours that Commonwealth forces had held Kapyong had given UN headquarters time to establish new defensive lines, bring forward reserves, and prepare for a coordinated counteroffensive that would be launched 3 days later. The Battle of Kapyong was over. 700 Commonwealth soldiers had fought 15,000 Chinese soldiers for 74 hours and had achieved their mission objective. It would be recognized as one of the most significant defensive actions of the Korean War. April 25, 1951, through present day, legacy and recognition. The 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, and the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, reached their assembly areas 8 kilometers south of Kapyong at 0600 hours on April 25, 1951. Both units immediately began casualty assessments, equipment inventories, and preparations for potential follow-on operations. The numbers were sobering. Canadian casualties: 42 killed in action, 117 wounded, 3 missing presumed killed. Total: 162 casualties out of approximately 700 engaged, representing a 23% casualty rate. Australian casualties: 38 killed in action, 76 wounded, 2 missing. Total: 116 casualties out of approximately 500 engaged, representing a 23% casualty rate. Combined Commonwealth casualties: 278 soldiers killed or wounded over 74 hours of continuous combat. Chinese casualties were significantly higher, but difficult to determine precisely. Commonwealth estimates based on body counts, prisoner interrogations, and area reconnaissance indicated that Chinese forces had suffered approximately 1,900 casualties during the Battle of Kapyong, 1,400 killed and 500 wounded. The casualty ratio favored Commonwealth forces by approximately 7-1, testament to the effectiveness of defensive positions, artillery support, and superior training. But the raw casualty figures did not fully capture the significance of what Commonwealth forces had achieved. The 27th Brigade's defense of Kapyong had delayed Chinese forces for 74 critical hours during the fifth phase offensive, time that UN headquarters used to establish new defensive lines and organize a counteroffensive. More importantly, the defense had demonstrated that Chinese human wave tactics, which had been devastatingly effective earlier in the war, could be defeated by well-trained forces occupying prepared positions with adequate artillery support. On April 27, 1951, 2 days after the battle ended, Lieutenant General Matthew Bunker Ridgway, commander of the U.S. 8th Army in Korea, visited the 27th Brigade's assembly area. Ridgway was not prone to excessive praise. He was a hard, demanding commander who expected excellence and rarely acknowledged it when he received it. But what he said to the assembled Commonwealth soldiers would be repeated in military histories for decades. You held when others broke. You fought when others ran. You have written a page in military history that will be studied as long as soldiers study the art of defensive warfare. Ridgway's assessment was not hyperbole. Within weeks, U.S. military analysts were studying the Battle of Kapyong to identify lessons learned. The defensive tactics employed by Commonwealth forces, particularly the Canadian use of danger-close artillery fire called on their own positions, were incorporated into U.S. Army doctrine for defensive operations. The battle was analyzed at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, taught to officer candidates, and used as a case study in defensive tactics. On May 4, 1951, the United States government awarded the Presidential Unit Citation to both the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, and the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. The Presidential Unit Citation is the highest unit award the United States can bestow, equivalent to the Medal of Honor for individuals. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and outstanding performance of duty in action against the enemy in the vicinity of Kapyong, Korea." The 27th British Commonwealth Brigade was given a mission of holding open the avenue of approach to the south, which the enemy had utilized in previous attacks. The Commonwealth forces were placed astride this historic invasion route and ordered to hold at all costs. The award was unprecedented. Prior to Kapyong, no non-U.S. units had received the Presidential Unit Citation for Korean War service. The award recognized not just the tactical success of holding Kapyong, but the strategic significance of that defense. By stopping Chinese forces in the Kapyong corridor, Commonwealth troops had prevented Chinese forces from exploiting their successful penetration of UN lines elsewhere on the front. The defense had been the hinge upon which the entire UN defensive line pivoted. For the individual soldiers who had fought at Kapyong, the aftermath was complicated. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in 1951 the condition was poorly understood and rarely treated effectively. Some soldiers struggled with survivor's guilt, questioning why they had lived while comrades had died. Others experienced recurring nightmares, anxiety, difficulty adjusting to civilian life after their military service ended. Corporal Smiley McDonald, who had single-handedly held the draw against repeated Chinese assaults, was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, the second highest award for gallantry in the British Commonwealth military system. The citation described his actions. Throughout 3 days and nights of continuous fighting, Corporal McDonald displayed courage, determination, and devotion to duty of the highest order. On numerous occasions, he held critical positions against enemy attacks that threatened to overwhelm his unit. His actions were instrumental in the successful defense of the position and reflected great credit upon himself and the Canadian Army. McDonald returned to Canada in 1952 and struggled to adjust to civilian life. He had difficulty holding employment, experienced nightmares about the battle, and became socially isolated. In 1957, he was diagnosed with what military doctors called combat fatigue and was hospitalized for 8 months. He eventually recovered sufficiently to lead a relatively normal life, working as a carpenter in Vancouver, but he rarely spoke about his experiences at Kapyong. When asked about the battle in a 1977 interview, he said, "Simply, we did what we had to do. That's all soldiers ever do." Lieutenant Michael Levy, who had led counterattacks during the battle, continued his military career and eventually rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel. He commanded the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, from 1968 to 1970, the same unit he had served with at Kapyong. When asked to describe the significance of the battle, Levy was characteristically direct. Kapyong proved that well-trained Commonwealth forces could stop Chinese human wave attacks if they had proper artillery support and defensive positions. That lesson probably saved thousands of lives during the rest of the Korean War because it gave UN commanders confidence that Chinese tactics could be defeated. Captain John Gordon Fothergill Mills, commander of D Company, was awarded the Military Cross for his leadership during the battle, particularly his decision to call artillery fire on his own position. The award citation stated, "Captain Mills displayed exceptional courage and tactical judgment throughout 3 days of intense combat. When his company position was threatened with being overrun, he made the difficult decision to request artillery fire on his own position, knowing that friendly casualties were possible. His decision saved his company from destruction and was instrumental in stopping the enemy assault." Mills never fully reconciled himself with that decision. In interviews conducted decades after the battle, he expressed ambivalence about calling artillery fire on his own soldiers. "2 men were wounded by our own artillery that night. They survived and the company survived, but I've always questioned whether there was an alternative. Maybe there was a better way. I don't know. I made the decision I thought was right at the time, and I've lived with it ever since." The tactical and strategic lessons from Kapyong influenced military doctrine far beyond the Korean War. The battle demonstrated several principles that became foundational to modern defensive warfare. First, well-trained infantry occupying prepared defensive positions with adequate artillery support can defeat numerically superior forces using human wave tactics. This lesson was particularly relevant during the Cold War, when NATO forces in Europe faced the prospect of Soviet numerical superiority and needed doctrine that would allow them to defeat mass attacks. Second, danger-close artillery fire, when properly coordinated, can be decisive in preventing defensive positions from being overrun. The Canadian use of artillery fire called on their own positions demonstrated that accepting risk from friendly fire was sometimes preferable to the certainty of being overrun by enemy forces. Third, defense in depth, surrendering forward positions to draw enemy forces into prepared killing zones, can be more effective than linear defense that attempts to hold every inch of ground. The Canadian decision to abandon forward positions and consolidate into a defensive box multiplied their combat power and reduced friendly casualties. Fourth, small unit leadership is critical in defensive operations. The battle was won not by brilliant operational planning, but by junior officers and NCOs making correct tactical decisions under extreme pressure. Corporal McDonald holding his position, Lieutenant Levy counterattacking penetrations, Captain Mills calling danger-close artillery. These individual decisions, made by soldiers aged 19 to 30, determined the outcome. The Chinese assessment of the Battle of Kapyong was equally instructive. Declassified Chinese military documents from the 1990s revealed that Chinese commanders viewed Kapyong as a turning point in their Korean War strategy. Prior to Kapyong, Chinese doctrine emphasized mass assaults accepting high casualties to overwhelm UN defenses. After Kapyong, Chinese commanders recognized that human wave tactics were unsustainable against well-defended positions with adequate artillery support. Chinese doctrine shifted toward infiltration tactics, night attacks, and attempts to isolate and destroy small UN units rather than assaulting prepared defenses directly. The long-term impact on the soldiers who fought at Kapyong was complex and varied. Some, like Lieutenant Levy, continued successful military careers. Others struggled with physical and psychological wounds for decades. 3 Canadian soldiers and 2 Australian soldiers who fought at Kapyong eventually took their own lives, suicides that family members attributed to unresolved trauma from the battle. Many more live with physical disabilities, hearing loss from artillery fire, mobility limitations from wounds, chronic pain from injuries sustained during the battle. The Canadian and Australian governments provided pensions and medical care for Kapyong veterans, but the quality of that care varied significantly. Early veterans received minimal mental health support because post-traumatic stress disorder was poorly understood in the 1950s and 1960s. Later veterans benefited from improved understanding of combat trauma, but by then many had already suffered for decades without treatment. The battlefield at Kapyong has been preserved as a historical site by the South Korean government. Hill 677 and Hill 504 remain largely as they were in 1951, still bearing the scars of artillery fire and defensive fortifications. In 1997, the South Korean government erected a memorial to the Canadian and Australian soldiers who fought there. The memorial includes bronze plaques listing the names of all Commonwealth soldiers killed during the battle and a stone marker with an inscription in Korean, English, and French. In April 1951, soldiers of Canada and Australia stood on this ground and held back overwhelming enemy forces. Their sacrifice and courage saved countless lives and preserved the freedom of the Republic of Korea. Each year on April 25th, the anniversary of the battle's end, veterans who are still alive return to Kapyong for a remembrance ceremony. The number of attendees has declined steadily as veterans age and pass away. In 2021, only 6 Kapyong veterans were still alive, all in their 90s. They attended a modified ceremony held in Canada and Australia due to COVID-19 restrictions. The youngest veteran, now 92, said in a 2021 interview, "We held that ground because we were ordered to hold it. That's what soldiers do. I don't think we realized at the time how significant it would be. We were just trying to survive the night." Modern military historians rank the Battle of Kapyong among the most significant defensive actions in 20th century military history. It is taught at military academies worldwide as an example of how training, leadership, and proper use of combined arms can overcome numerical disadvantage. The battle has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and academic studies, examining tactical decisions, leadership under fire, and the psychology of soldiers in sustained combat. The final assessment of Kapyong comes from an unexpected source, a 2003 interview with a former Chinese officer who had fought as a platoon leader in one of the units attacking Hill 677. He was asked why Chinese forces had not succeeded in overrunning the Commonwealth positions despite massive numerical superiority. His response captured the essence of why 700 soldiers have been able to stop 15,000. "We were brave, but bravery is not enough against soldiers who know their business." The Canadians and Australians knew how to fight. They used their weapons effectively. They helped each other. They did not panic. We attacked with courage, but they defended with skill. In the end, skill wins. That assessment, delivered more than 50 years after battle by a former enemy, may be the most accurate summary of what happened at Kapyong. 700 Commonwealth soldiers, most of them young men with limited combat experience, had stood against overwhelming odds and held. They held not because they were superhuman, but because they were well-trained, well-led, and determined to do their duty. They paid a terrible price, 278 casualties in 74 hours. But they accomplished their mission. They delayed Chinese forces long enough for new defensive lines to be established. And in doing so, they wrote a page in military history that continues to be studied 7 decades later. The legacy of Kapyong is not just the tactical lessons or the recognition received. The legacy is a demonstration that ordinary soldiers, when properly trained and led, can achieve extraordinary results under the most extreme circumstances. The farmers and clerks and factory workers who became Canadian and Australian infantrymen did not set out to become heroes. They set out to do their duty. At Kapyong, duty required them to stand and fight against odds that suggested they should fail. They stood, they fought, they held, and 74 hours later, when they finally withdrew, they left behind a battlefield that Chinese forces had paid for with 2,000 casualties. The Commonwealth soldiers had proven that courage and determination, combined with skill and proper support, could overcome any numerical disadvantage. It is a lesson that remains relevant to military forces worldwide, and it is a reason that the Battle of Kapyong continues to be remembered, studied, and honored more than 7 decades after the last shot was fired.